I don't have anything profound to propose. And following John, who has some really incredible research things that he's put forward, I just want to say you're probably feeling a bit overwhelmed, so take this 18 minutes to relax a bit, because I'm only 24 and I'm only, going to share a few stories with you. But the 3 stories that I am going to share today, they're the stories that I believe are probably some of the most untold stories I've had the opportunity to work on. Before I get to those stories, though, I'm a Newcastle boy. I've lived here since I was 12, and I moved from the country, and up until the age of 16, I'd say I lived a pretty normal teenage life. I was at school, I was living the dream, part-time working at McDonald's for $7 an hour. I was saving for a Nissan Skyline I was hoping to have by the time I had my red peas. I played football, and I occasionally drowned on the surf as a weekend warrior. And it was in year 11 that I had an opportunity to go to Cambodia. I was at my school and they were doing a talk. Someone had come from a school in Cambodia for children affected by landmines, and being one of the class jocks or clowns, not sure where I would have fitted, but I was the guy up the back that was, courting an audience of friends and pretty much disrupting the class. And my teacher asked me, "Connor, can you stop that?" And we had the Newcastle show the next day, which meant we'd have the school surf comp, and I was pumped to try and make past round 1. So I was, looking through the surf magazine, and to no avail, I kept going. So she eventually moved me. "Come with me, Connor. Come with me. Now, Connor, I'm going to put you up the front here, and I'm going to ask you about this talk after. And I'm going to ask you what you've learned today." And it's interesting because I had never really done anything for anyone else aside from buy $2 presents for my siblings for Christmas. I can say that absolutely. As a 16-year-old, I hadn't done much for anyone else. But after this talk, I was left with this real sense of amazement that, wow, I want to go out into this world, and I want to go out and experience things. And I was lucky enough to go on that trip. The Nissan Skyline fell by the wayside, but Paul Walker in Need for Speed was enough for the moment. And I went to Cambodia for 2 weeks, and I had a time that was, quite revolutionary for a 16-year-old. And I came back and I started a social justice group, and we got engaged, fundraising money, and we managed to get our hands on 25 grand for 2 projects in East Timor, where we then spent 2 months volunteering as opposed to a normal schoolies trip. Coming back from that, I was 18, as most 18-year-olds with parents who are kind of, own a house in New Lambton. "Connor, what are you going to do?" Well, I did the right thing. I deferred from university, and I took 3 part-time jobs after handing out probably about 300 resumes in Newcastle. And I took 3 part-time jobs and saved money for the first half of the year and went to India. Now, I went to India at 18, fresh with this heart full of fire, because I was going to make a difference. I was there to help. I knew, I knew that I could handle it. I was told not to go in May because it is usually 38 to 40 degrees, 90% humidity, and the monsoon's about to come. But I was tough and I was passionate, and I went anyway. 6 months condensed into 30 seconds, I had an incredibly tough time. I was on the phone to my mother after 2 months, in tears, Googling what is depression. The backpacker's next to me like, "Yeah, what's wrong with him?" And I was, and I was speaking to my mum, and I was like, "I just can't handle this. I hate this place. It's hot. No one understands me. I can't even talk to anyone. The World Cup of soccer just finished. I've got nothing. I just want to come home." And my mother's a social worker, thank God. So she used her skills on me and said, "Connor, breathe. Okay, I'm breathing. Okay, good. Now, Connor, don't change your flight." "Why not?" "Where would you like to go?" So I'd been interested in Buddhism, so I went to the Himalayas of India, and I spent 3 months up there. And as I spent my 3 months there, I also put to use my little $700 camera that I'd bought before my trip. And it was over there that I started to realise that photography could be a really powerful medium. That was 2006. 2006, now 5 years. So 5 years, I did go back to university, and to all of my relatives' delight, I finally finished my degree at some point in the past. And when I was at university plodding along, I was working in the youth sector, continuing to engage in the community development area, because it's where I thought I wanted to work and commit my life. But as I was doing that, I was travelling each year and working on photo projects. And by 2009, I realised that was actually my medium that I was prepared to give everything to. And in 2009, I started freelancing for large humanitarian organisations on assignments in the developing world. And so 2009 to now, I have worked on a whole range of projects, but the three that I want to show are three that I feel, as I said earlier, are the most untold. And I sat with this project. These are 4 projects that I'm not going to share, but these are just moments from... This is climate change on the border of India and Tibet, and it's a project that I've gone back and worked on. Because for me, I believe that to tell a story, you need to be involved on a long-term basis. I did think about sharing that story as well as child mortality in Papua New Guinea, such as you can see a child here suffering from hydrocephalus. And I was here in 2010 in the morning at Port Moresby General Hospital, and later that evening I was sitting back in Sydney. Climate change activism in Australia is another project that I've been working on, as well as Muslim communities within Newcastle. But I did decide that the 3 stories I want to tell are ones that maybe people are aware of, but maybe I could shed a little bit more light on. So, birth of a nation. A lot of people probably realise that South Sudan this year became the world's newest nation. Now, for me, my connection with South Sudan was that around the same time I went to Cambodia, I met a lot of young Sudanese people who'd recently moved into New Lambton. And initially we started hanging out, playing soccer, downloading Bob Marley and Glenn Washington mixtapes, you know, doing the kind of stuff that most 16, 17-year-olds do. And it's only really as I was at university and I was hanging out more with these young guys that I started to kind of unpack and understand more about their context and what their life, what had actually happened in their life. And as I was spending time with these young guys who are a group of hip-hoppers and they'd just finished school last year, I was hanging out and kind of telling their story in photos in 2010. And I heard their mother say, I heard Deng's mother say, this is Deng's bedroom. I heard Deng's mother say one day that she was going to Sydney for an election party, and this was early this year. And I said, the election? And she said, yes, we had the election, and 99% of South Sudan, or 98.93% of South Sudan, voted for independence. So I heard that, and I thought about it, and I sat with it for a while, and I was quite busy on assignments for the first half of the year, so I decided that in June this year I would go to South Sudan. This is a Tong. A Tong Atem is 20. She's studying fine arts at Sydney College of the Arts in Sydney. Atong Atem was born in Ethiopia. Her father was a political journalist who had political asylum in Ethiopia from an early part of the Second Civil War. Atong was born in Ethiopia. She grew up in Kenya for her childhood years until she moved to the Central Coast. I'd met Atong last year at some different points, and I'd gone along early this year and met her mother, Anna, who lives in the Central Coast with Atong's 4 other siblings. And I talked to Atong about independence, and she told me that she and her mother, Anna, were going back for independence. And so for me, going to South Sudan, which is quite literally on the other side of the world, I knew that to tell the story, and particularly for an Australian audience, I wanted to have some Australian connection. Because I've been told time and time again by newspapers in Australia that, look, unless there's some Aussie connection, I just can't run this stuff. So to try and make this relevant, I went back with Atong and her mother, Anna. But most importantly, I was following Atong's journey as she went and met her relatives. This is her grandfather, who she met for the first time. Her grandfather was quite influential in the start of the Second Civil War in the early 80s. And I put in these black and white portraits because I thought that's quite a poignant, intimate moment that you rarely see in South Sudan. And so while this was a big part of my experience going and meeting Atong's family and seeing her returning and how she felt, I was there also in South Sudan for almost 2 months working on assignments for other organisations. After landing in South Sudan, 3 days after landing, I shot straight up in a plane to Malakal. And Malakal's the largest township before the border between North and South Sudan. Malakal had been the site of conflict about 2 months before I was there. And I arrived at a rather large orphanage called SOS Children's Village, which is a big one in Europe. And I arrived at their orphanage aware that there'd been conflict that had taken place in the compound, but I didn't actually realise the extent of it until I arrived. And as I did arrive and the houses in the orphanage are kind of running parallel, I saw and I kind of experienced as I stayed there for a week, the actual impact of conflict on people. And while I've documented that in other parts of the world, such as Gaza, and Nepal post-conflict and Timor, seeing it in South Sudan and seeing children still living in those conditions was really raw. Seeing the entry mark of a bullet through a metal gauze in a window as it then heads through a door and ends up lodging in a fridge. Or seeing the look of children seeing the look of children in an orphanage when they look up at the gates that open and they're looking up to see who's coming through the door. And I asked the village director, who's from the Shilluk tribe, who was the dominant tribe of the area, why are the children so fearful? And he said they are fearful because they're not sure who to trust anymore. And since that conflict, it only lasted for a few hours, but it started very early when everyone was in bed. Since then, the children have been very on edge. And so this is just one fragment of my experience in South Sudan. Probably the most important part of my experience in South Sudan was the actual independence. And so on midnight of July the 8th, 2011, I was heading to the main hospital in Juba, the capital of South Sudan, and I was wading my way through the streets as crowds were celebrating on top of cars, in between bonnets and motors of cars, 5 guys on the backs of motorbikes, and generally it was a really happy festival vibe. There was, of course, celebratory gunfire and flammable cans with lighters, but generally most people were incredibly ecstatic that that moment of independence had finally come. But I wasn't on the streets all night. I was actually going to work for Unicef, and I was going to the hospital to document the first children that were being born as part of the new nation. And it was quite an incredible experience for the women out there, and as John talked about reproduction, I didn't actually watch the birth of the child. I waited outside, but I did come in for the first 3 children and document. As you can see, the children and kind of the sense in the room as the first children of the independent country were born. And that was probably one of the most profound experiences I did have there in my 2 months. Of course, on July the 9th, there was all of the normal celebrations with the pulling down of the old Northern Sudan flag and the raising of the new Republic of South Sudan's flag. But there was also a lot of tears. There was also a lot of people who, on that moment of independence, realised what they'd lost in the 25-year conflict, which only ended in 2005 with the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. So in my time there, and it was only about 2 months, I worked as hard as I could with the digital work that you can see, but also with film work, to try and tell a story of Australian communities and Australian Sudanese who had gone to South Sudan to reconnect with family, but also try and comment on some of the more wider issues. And John talked about the fact that in the future, 90%, I think, of the world's population is going to be living in developing countries. Well, South Sudan, unfortunately, has some of the worst development indicators. And in South Sudan, for my work for Unicef doing a multimedia piece, I was given a stat to use in it, and it was that young women are more likely to die during childbirth than to ever graduate primary school. And statistics like that are quite hard to fathom, particularly when you're working and you're trying to develop a visual narrative that's going to engage with an audience but also inform them. And so this is the second last image from this body of work, but these were 2 American Sudanese girls who'd come back, and it was interesting to see these guys kicking around with big speakers and their Ray-Bans. But while a cynical part of me could have come out and wondered about kind of the corruption, because it was very evident when I was there, I resigned myself to just try and understand how important it was for these Sudanese who were returning. But while, as I said, I couldn't be cynical, or we can all kind of hold back with cringe as we look at other new democracies that have formed around the world, I do believe there is a lot of hope for South Sudan. And so this image of one of the children who was born at midnight, who was named Salva Kiir after the president, he reached out his hand a little bit, which I thought was quite cute. So that's my image of hope and my future, what I hope for the future of South Sudan. The second story that I just want to share is about homelessness and mental illness, but more importantly, the mental illness than the homelessness. And this is in Calcutta. Calcutta was where I went when I was 18, full of that fire and passion, going to make a difference in the slums. And I've gone back there 4 times now, and since that initial trip, every other time has been to work on this project on mental illness. West Bengal is the state of where Calcutta is, and West Bengal is the 4th most populous state of India. It has about 95 million people. There's only 2 NGOs, in fact, working in the whole state around mental illness, 2 funded by donors largely in Europe and America. One of them, Anjali, works in the 3 mental health institutions in the state, while the other one, Ishopanthi, works on the streets. I initially started working in the institutions but was struggling to have access, so I was introduced to Ishopanthi. And when I was working with Ishopanthi, I was working on the streets, particularly with a group of women, about a dozen women who live outside Shalda Station, which is the biggest train station in Calcutta. And it was there where I spent my first 2 trips, from sunrise to sunset, trying to tell the story of these women. And initially I was trying to tell the story of how resilient they are. And it was difficult to do because these women's lives, or their daily lives, was inhabited by survival. Going and trying to find vegetables that may have been discarded from the markets, begging, or going to try and other places to try and get new clothes, or to find taps and somewhere private to wash. But this is Asma, who you saw in that first image, and she's one of the women who I kind of followed more closely. And it was very difficult at times, and it was very difficult to realise what kind of impact this work was having. But I just want to skip back to this one image, because on my last trip, this is a portrait of someone who's actually from the middle class. She's got a university degree, she works in the service industry, but she also suffers from a mental illness. And it was when I started to realise that mental illness is probably the biggest wall it faces in India is the stigma attached to it. And while my work was telling the story and the resilience of these women who live in the streets, I realised that if I really want to inform an Indian audience, which is what I'd like to do, I need to also tell the story of mental illness being something that affects the middle class. And so this woman, Rathgod, she was one of the women who lives at Shalda Station. She could actually speak English, the only one there. And Rathgod's story was that she's from Delhi, she was married and she had children, and she, at some stage, had some kind of an episode, and a few months later it ended up in Calcutta. And when I'd met Rathgod, we were talking in English, and we were able to discuss things and discuss India, and it was quite interesting. And that was probably one of the things that made me bridge the gap between these women who live in the streets, but also the reality that a lot of people in the middle class, World Health Organization estimates 1 in 4 people globally suffer from some kind of mental illness. And so Rathgod really helped to kind of me to think that maybe this story can be taken more widely. If I do want an Indian audience to see this, and see this as something that can help to maybe break down some of the stereotyping about what is mental illness. And so the last story that I'm going to show, I'm a little bit behind with my slides, but the last story that I'm going to share with you is about Borneo. It's about the Penan tribe. Let me just get there. It's about the Penan tribe, who are the last nomadic community living in Borneo. Borneo, as most people would know, is half owned by it's Indonesian and Malaysian split. And last year I was at a conference in a different part of Malaysia where Bapa Sagung, this man here, travelled for his first time in his life out of the jungle, first time on a plane, first time doing a lot of things. And he'd come to share his story of what was the life remaining for the 7 families who continued to live nomadically in the jungle. And I met Bapa Sagung at a conference where I was doing the photo and the multimedia documentary work, and he was itching his legs in his kind of plastic shoes and, standing there very uncomfortable in clothes. And I remember at first seeing him looking at all the trees, his eyes darting around, and I was wondering if he was really bored. I found out on our way back into the jungle that in fact he was looking at the fat monkeys and lamenting he didn't bring his blow dart. But Bapa Sagung was quite an incredible man. When he was talking there amongst another probably dozen or so speakers from other Indigenous communities, I was drawn to him, and I was drawn to ask if I could go back into the jungle with him. And I asked a man from a different part of Borneo, which was translating if I could, and Bapa Sagung on the last night at 9 o'clock relayed back that I could come. I then had to go and quickly change all of my flights and leave the next morning at 6 a.m. on a ferry, and then 2 flights, another long boat up the river, stay overnight, another long boat, 5-hour four-wheel drive, and then a 3-hour walk into the jungle. But it was absolutely worth it. I got a week of time and a period to go and to live with Bapa Sagung and his family in the jungle. Now, Bapa Sagung is the head man in his family, and head men are usually the oldest man, such as Nia, who's standing behind. But Bapa Sagung, due to his commitment to trying to preserve the remaining forest, was chosen to be the head man. And so Bapa Sagung took me through the jungle with him quite a few days out of my 7 there. And it was amazing to see the jungle as not just, the shelter, but also, if we can translate it for us to understand, also the supermarket, also the chemist. The jungle provided everything. And as we moved around on our first day, I saw Bapa Sagung walking around and touching, some of the trees. And I kind of asked him at some point what they're for. And he pulled out his middle of his 3 knives that they carry on their waist. And he kind of hit one of the trees and held his knife there, and he told me that this tree was for chest problems. He told me another one was for a certain kind of cancer, another one was for cuts, and after a while I realised just how comprehensive their life was, and that actually they existed totally in that jungle. One of the most amazing things about their life is that they only eat sago, which is probably for us a rice equivalent, if you don't know what sago is, and they hunt animals in the jungle ranging from pigs to monkeys and lizards and deer. But they showed me how they make their poison darts. And as we were walking through the part of the forest, Bapa Sagung pointed to a big tree, and from probably 20 metres away, it looked like it had acne scars all up the side of it. And as I came closer, I realised they were actually years of cuts that had slowly kind of healed. And as we went up to it, Bapa Sagung made a little angle cut into it with, fresh wood being exposed, and he did that, and we went on our way. As we came back later on, Bapa Sagung collected it in part of a palm and rolled it up, and as we got home, they cooked up the black tar-looking stuff and added it to their darts. And it was then that I realised at that point that Bapa Sagung and the 7 other Penan families, they are probably one of the last nomadic communities we have in Southeast Asia. I don't want to say the last because I can't actually verify that. But on my last day, I said to Bapa Sagung, through the other men who was translating and who travelled with me, I said, Bapa Sagung, what do you want me to do with this work? What do you want me to do with this? And he said to me, I want you to tell everyone about us. I want you to tell everyone our story, because 2015 is when all of the logging licences finished in Borneo, are completed. So that's the aim from the logging point of view, is that hopefully Borneo will be as close to as, if not totally decimated. And Borneo State Minister is aiming that the island of Borneo will be the highest palm oil producer. And so knowing that, and knowing that unfortunately Bapa Sagung, his family and the other 7 families will potentially end up in permanent housing, I feel probably the greatest honour, but also the greatest burden to share that story. And I've had this great opportunity to be here, and I thank the TED organisers and all of the other amazing speakers who are here today. But these are my stories. Well, these are the stories of the communities I've had the chance to live and work with. Thank you.